Welcome back to Let's Make a Game, a channel about making computer role-playing games using the free program Twine and the Sugarcube format for Twine. In this video, I would like to continue my series on using the fighting fantasy rules in a Twine game, and specifically in a Twine game using the Sword and Planet subgenre of science fiction for its setting. In the last video in this series, I read out one possible beginning to the game, and in this video I'd like to read out another and then read out what happens after that. Once I've read all those, I will talk briefly about some of the choices that I've made, and then we will look at the code. Although there is very little code because I've been mostly writing more than coding, but what there is, we'll have a look at it. So first, let's read this new beginning. When you stubbed your toe on the strange object, shaped like the corner of a cube buried on your parents' farm, you knew at once that you would not tell anyone about it, although you could not have said why. Nor could you have said why you kept returning to that seldom used patch of land. Your frustration, often close to rage at your limited life, was just as intense, and yet it seemed easier to bear. It was as if you were telling your frustrations to a friend, not keeping them unspoken inside you. This was especially true if you touched the cube. You spent time digging it out, even when winter came and your fingers grew numb, even though there seemed to be no end to it. What you had first thought to be the size of a small stone revealing more and more of itself, until you wondered if it were bigger than the pyramids of Egypt. There came a day when you could lean your whole body against it, as one might lean against a sweetheart. And as soon as you did so, the world disappeared. And then when we click that, we get this. You hurtle through an endless void. You cannot say whether you are rising, falling, or neither, whether you are awake or asleep, whether you are alive or dead. At last, the void becomes the pure blue of a cloudless sky. You are no longer suspended in nothingness, but standing in the midst of dense jungle. The colours of the jungle are more vivid than anything you have ever seen. You notice two combinations of colours impossible on Earth. The first contains both yellow and blue, but does not combine them into green. The other contains, but does not combine, red and green. And if we restart, we should find that... Sorry, this keeps popping up for some reason. We should find that what I just read to you and the beginning that I read in the video in this series before that come up sort of roughly half the time each. In other words, it randomly chooses one of those two beginnings, and then from either of them, although it seems to be, there we go. And from either of them, we end up at this same place, hurtling through an endless void and then ending up in this jungle. So, why have two different beginnings that go to the same place? What's the point of having the two choices? Well, the point of it is that each of them will give your character particular advantages and disadvantages, which will become relevant later in the game. So the one that I read just then, where you are growing up on a farm, perhaps doing so has sort of made you tougher than perhaps other characters, and so perhaps your stamina is higher, or perhaps it gives you the ability to sort of haggle. People who grow up when there's a family business often sort of learn things about the business that other people of their age don't, and so perhaps you're sort of used to bargaining and used to sort of driving a hard bargain, and that will come up later. And as for a disadvantage, perhaps you're a bit sheltered, perhaps you're a bit naive, and so perhaps you're more likely to be, conned in the big city, or wander into an area that's dangerous or something like that, and not sort of notice the danger signs. I haven't yet decided exactly on what the advantages would be. There's sort of one or two possibilities. And similarly, the other character, the one who's desperate for money and answers an ad, perhaps they have bad luck, and so they don't roll their luck in the normal way. They just start with a luck of 6 or 7, but perhaps they're able to sleep rough in the city, and so they can keep themselves fairly safe and fairly warm at night, and so they avoid dangers that that other characters risk. So let me tell you what I intend to do with these choices. I intend to have at least 2, possibly 3 others. I've got a few candidates. Perhaps you will be a scientist, perhaps you will be an explorer, perhaps you'll be someone who's sort of interested in the occult or new religious movements or something, and finds out that one group that promises a new life on a different planet is actually, is actually telling the truth. And of course, each of those will have their own advantage and their own disadvantage. What I intend to do after that is write the main plot in more detail than it currently is. I already have a very rough sketch of what's going to happen. You will first meet a non-human group of hunter-gatherers that live in this jungle. You may end up living with them, sharing their tribulations. After that, you may go to a city where there are humans, basically, and there you will meet the person who is your true love, the person that you sort of instantly fall in love with, which is a real trope of this genre. And the rest of the plot is you, if you're successful, overcoming the obstacles to being with this person, which include, of course, them, not wanting to be with you, but also include more external dangers, like perhaps the person is the ruler of the city and the city is at war with an evil city, or perhaps they get kidnapped, by someone and you have to go rescue them, and so on. So I intend to sort of break that down into more detail, using what I know of the genre. Because, and this is possibly a bit controversial, you might not agree with this, but I think that role-playing games, broadly speaking, whether they be tabletop games or computer games or, like this one, the point of them is to allow the player to pretend to participate in a genre which they already know. So if they like detective fiction, well, this gives them an opportunity to play the detective or play the murderer, whatever, to try and sort of engage with this genre that they already know. And so what you want to make that happen, you want to have as many tropes from the genre as possible. And hopefully, of course, you combine them in a sort of interesting way. You're not, and you're not just sort of cutting and pasting, but you do want to have those recognizable tropes. You want to give the player, you want the player to recognize, oh, cool, yes, okay, I like science fiction. I like particular types of science fiction. I like Star Trek, let's say, and I can see this arguing with this overly logical alien is a thing that happens in Star Trek, and so I sort of, I recognize that, and that makes it fun. So I'm interested in using the tropes of the genre. As an example, the impossible colours comes from a particular novel. I actually first came across it in a tabletop role-playing game supplement called Carcosa, Carcosa, for Dungeons and Dragons, but it comes from the novel A Voyage to Arcturus, which is it was written in the Victorian age, which is a bit earlier than the subgenre that we're talking about, and it was written when there wasn't really a science fiction genre or the same genre by any other name. So it's very much a sort of work in itself, but it's somewhat similar, or it uses some of the tropes that also turned up in Sword and Planet, one of which is just being transported to another planet and having adventures there, I suppose. They had the sun of this planet emanates 2 extra primary colours, which is not a thing that's possible, because colours are different wavelengths of light, and we know that if the wavelength gets too high or too low, it becomes infrared or ultraviolet. We just stop being able to see it. There aren't any spaces where there could be new colours. But I really liked the idea, and it is possible to sort of trick your eye into seeing impossible colours in various ways. And what I'm referring to with this colour that's both yellow and blue but not green, and the other one that's red and green but they don't combine, is a particular experiment where people saw an object but they were seeing a slightly different image in each eye. They were seeing a yellow image in one eye and a blue image in the other eye. And some people just saw it as green, but some people saw it as a colour that was both yellow and blue but didn't become green. And I've had a similar experience to that when I was a child with a toy called a Viewmaster, which gave you two different images in a different image in each eye, with the idea of making a three-dimensional, or making the image appear three-dimensional. There was a Transformers reel where I noticed, I said, these lasers are weird because they're pink and they're green. How can it be pink and green at the same time? And I eventually worked out or noticed that it was because the image was, the laser was yellow in one eye and pink in one image and green in the other. And my brain had sort of combined that into a colour that was both pink and green, as these people in the experiment probably experienced. So that's an example of a trope that I'm sort of making use of. And then once I've done the main outline of the plot, of course, it's a choose your own adventure style story, and so the plot is different each time. But once I've sketched out the sort of main line of what might happen, then it's a matter of turning that into individual scenes and acts and individual paragraphs, and sort of altering it as we go. Because, of course, in my experience, when you're typing up these things, you always think of new things, and it doesn't quite turn out as your plan. It's slightly different at each stage. So when you're actually typing it up, it's not a matter of just turning your plan into paragraphs. You always think of new things or realise that something doesn't quite work or change them. So anyway, I'd be interested to know what people think of that. Is my writing clear? As I said in the last video in this series, it is definitely shorter than the introduction to a fighting fantasy book, but that's a choice I've made deliberately. I found those introductions too long, basically. But I'd be interested to hear what other people say. So the final thing I'll do is talk about the code. There's not much of it. The only code that we've got, let's get out of that and into this. So all this, everything sort of on this side is just the system for combat and the system for this displaying stuff in the sidebar, which we've already talked about all that. We're just leaving that there until we get to it. We really only are looking at these 4 pages. And what we need is the code that randomly sends us to either intro 1 or intro 2. So it's fairly simple. I think I've covered this in a previous video, but it's always worth covering again. Let's scroll down a bit. All right. So here it is. These are the 2 lines we need to look at. We set $Z equals quote intro quote plus random bracket 1 comma 2 end bracket. Random 1 2 is a random integer from 1 to 2 inclusive. So in other words, it will be 1 or 2 with equal probability. And so we'll end up with either the text intro 1 or intro to. And then we use a go to command. We could also use an include command. It'd be exactly the same really in this particular case. The difference between go to and include, the most significant difference anyway, is that go to refreshes the screen. So you can't print something and then have a go to and expect it to show up, whereas an include does keep the things that were printed beforehand. The other difference is that if you get to the end of the program after using an include and there's more code down here, that code will then execute once the include is finished, whereas a go to ignores any code that's down here. But in this particular circumstance, that neither of those things make any difference because there's no previous printing and there's no code after that. So in this case, I just happen to use go to. And go to normally, I guess, is go to a particular page. So you might put go to start or something like that, and the same is true of include. But in either case, you can instead have a variable, and it will try to go to whatever this variable is, giving you an error if it's one that is impossible. But in this case, it's always going to be intro 1 or intro 2, and I have made intro 1 and intro 2. They're just the different beginnings and a button to continue. And when we have the advantages and disadvantages decided on, that will be encoded in these two pages as well. And both of them send you to this one start, which gives you the hurdle through an endless void code, and also sets C equal to 1. We've already talked about that. That allows the skill, stamina and luck to be displayed on the sidebar. So in this case, there never will be an error. And of course, when I have more introductions, instead of saying random 1 to 2, it'll say random 1 to 4 or 5 or whatever, and I'll have intro 3, intro 4, possibly intro 5, and so on. So you might ask, well, what happens if you don't have a set of pages which have a similar form of name? What if they're all different names? How would you do that? Well, let's look at that. Let's say we set B. Let's call that an array. Let's put null in the zeroth slot of the array because I always find it easier to start from 1. And let's say these are the names of the let's say you're playing cards in the story, and there's 4 possibilities. You can lose, you can win, you can sort of tie, or the hand can be interrupted. And let's say we call those pages lose hand, win hand, draw hand, and hand interrupted. And let's say we want to go to those 4 pages with equal probability, and it isn't dependent on any skill that we have. It's just a random choice. So what we might do is we might set an array with those 4 possibilities, and then we might do this. We might, we'll set Z equals $B. So we set Z equal to $B square bracket random bracket 1 to 4 end bracket n square bracket. So the computer will look at that and say, okay, firstly, random 1 to 4. Well, I know what that is. That's choose 1, 2, 3, or 4. Let's say it chooses 3. And then it says, okay, so now I want $B square bracket 3 n square bracket, which means slot 3 in that array. It'll look in $B and see that that's draw hand. Okay. And then we would have either include or go to $Z. And so it'll say, okay, go to $Z. Well, I know what $Z is. I've set it to be draw hand. I will go to draw hand. And that is how you could do it if the if there wasn't a sort of, if it wasn't possible to have simple patterns in the names of the names of the pages. Perhaps they were pages that you could get to in other ways and that you'd already given a name, or perhaps there was a couple of different random branches, and some of the pages were in both of them. But for whatever reason, you can't just call them intro 1, intro 2, intro 3, and intro 4. Well, probably the best way to do it is with an array like that. All right, and that is the code. So what I've told you about my future plans, that's not, I'm not going to have all that done in the next video, I don't think. It's more like sort of at least the next 2 or 3. And honestly, usually I find that things take longer than I thought they would, in terms of how many videos it's going to take to explain a thing. So, you know, maybe it will be even longer than that. But that is my plan. And as I said before, I'm interested in your feedback on any element of it. But for now, I hope that was useful or interesting to at least some of you. And I hope you will tune in next time.